The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of my grandmother's roses as I rocked gently on the porch swing, sipping my coffee. The Victorian house had stood for over a century, painted in its signature deep purple trim that tourists often stop to admire. It was more than a home, it was a legacy, a living memory of the woman who had raised me. I took in the golden hues of the rising sun stretching across the sky, letting the warmth settle over me. And then I saw her. Karen Thompson. She was power walking up my driveway like she was marching into battle, her 2 white sneakers crunching against the gravel. In her perfectly manicured hand, she clutched an envelope as though it held the fate of the world inside. I knew that look. I'd seen it at every neighborhood meeting she had hijacked since moving in last year. It was the expression of someone who believed rules were weapons, and that control was her divine right. I set my coffee down and exhaled slowly as she reached my mailbox, carefully slipping the envelope inside before pulling out her phone. The familiar click of a camera followed. My stomach tightened. She was documenting my home, my porch, my garden, my windows. No doubt collecting evidence for whatever ridiculous complaint she was cooking up next. My grandmother's roses bloomed wildly in the front yard, a burst of color against the rigid boxwood hedges Karen had installed next door. She hated those roses. They were too free, too uncontained, too alive for her perfectly curated, beige soulless vision of the neighborhood. I waited until she was back on the sidewalk before retrieving the envelope. My breath hitched as I unfolded its contents. A glossy brochure slid out, depicting identical, lifeless houses, each painted the same sterile shade of taupe with matching mailboxes and neatly trimmed, HOA-approved lawns. A formal invitation to join their newly formed homeowners association. My fingers tightened around the paper. The invitation came with a $5,000 mandatory buy-in fee, plus a $350 monthly due for the privilege of following their suffocating rules. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was the attached document titled Mandatory Property Modifications. I scanned the list, my pulse rising with every demand. Remove all non-approved paint colors, including current trim, purple, and repaint in HOA standard neutrals. Replace all non-regulation vegetation with HOA-approved landscaping. Remove unapproved decorative elements, including wind chimes and antique porch railings. I gritted my teeth. My grandmother had planted those roses herself. She had painted this house with her own hands. The wind chimes had lulled me to sleep as a child. This wasn't just about aesthetics. They wanted to erase history. Through the window, I watched Karen stroll back toward her house, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice carried in that saccharine sweet tone that made my skin crawl. Yes, I just delivered the final invitation. She'll have to join now, her house is the last holdout. Once she falls in line, property values will finally start rising. I placed the invitation back in the envelope and stared at the document in my hands. That evening, I walked up to Karen's house, past the pristine driveway lined with identical garden gnomes, past the overly polished welcome sign that looked like it had been sanitized of any personality. I rang the doorbell, which chimed a cheerful, instrumental version of We Are the Champions. Of course it did. Karen opened the door, a smug smile stretching across her face. A neighborhood watch captain badge was pinned neatly to her sweater, as if she had appointed herself sheriff of suburbia. She didn't say hello, just stood there, waiting for me to acknowledge her self-importance. I held up the invitation. I've reviewed your proposal. My years in the courtroom kept my voice steady. I need to decline. Her smile vanished so fast it might have been a trick of the light. You don't understand, she said, stepping closer. This isn't really an invitation. The HOA has already been registered. You have to join. I pulled out the property deed I had researched earlier that afternoon, unfolding it slowly. Actually, that's incorrect, I said, my voice as measured as ever. My deed predates any HOA agreements. I have no legal obligation to join. Her face turned an interesting shade of red. Listen here, she hissed, her fake nice tone slipping. This neighborhood is changing. Progress is happening. If you don't get with the program, things might get difficult. Accidents happen. Houses that don't comply have a way of, she paused, her lips curling into a knowing smile, falling apart. A chill ran through me, but I didn't flinch. I met her gaze steadily. Is that a threat, Mrs. Thompson? She stepped back, her sugary smile returning. Of course not. I'm just concerned about your property's safety. Old houses like yours can be so unpredictable. Electrical problems, structural issues, it would be awful if something happened. Behind her, I noticed her husband, Bob, watching from their living room window, his phone in hand. The way he stood, too stiff, too prepared, made something deep in my gut twist. I gave her a polite nod and turned to leave. But as I stepped off her porch, her voice rang out behind me. 1 week. I stopped. You have 1 week to reconsider before the HOA board meets to discuss enforcement options. As I walked home, I noticed curtains shifting in the windows of other houses. Karen's allies. Watching. Waiting. I'd been in enough courtrooms to recognize the start of a battle. That night, I installed security cameras around my home, making sure to document everything. Karen Thompson thought this was about property values. She had no idea who she was messing with. And she had no idea that this was just the beginning. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of muffled voices outside my window. Pushing the curtain aside, I found Karen standing on my front lawn, flanked by 2 of her HOA enforcers, clipboard in hand. Her lips curled in distaste as she gestured toward my house, murmuring something I couldn't hear. One of the women beside her, Linda, if I remembered correctly, held up a measuring tape, stretching it across the base of my rose bushes. I threw on a sweater and stepped outside, coffee in hand, keeping my expression neutral. Karen turned, her fake smile already in place. Oh, good morning. We were just conducting our routine neighborhood compliance review. I glanced at Linda, who was feverishly scribbling in a notebook, and then at the bright orange citation taped to my front door. Non-compliant vegetation exceeding HOA height restrictions, I read aloud. I looked back at Karen. My roses have been here for 50 years. They're historic. I wasn't aware there was a regulation against history. Karen sighed, as if I was a particularly slow child who just couldn't grasp simple instructions. Well, new standards are in place now, and we just want to make sure everyone is maintaining property values. She looked pointedly at the purple trim along my windows, then back at me. I assume you're taking our previous discussion into consideration? I took a long sip of my coffee. Oh, I considered it. Then I smiled. And I decided I like my house exactly the way it is. Her smile tightened, and she exchanged a glance with Linda. Well, she said finally, voice syrupy sweet, I suppose that's your decision. I just hope you understand that without HOA membership, we can't protect you from the, complications that tend to arise when a home isn't up to code. And with that, she turned, leading her flock back to her pristine beige house. That same afternoon, I came home to another violation notice on my door. This time, it was for unauthorized wind chimes, the same ones that had hung from my grandmother's porch since I was a child. The next morning, another citation, this time claiming my trash bins were out past collection hours, even though I'd brought them in the night before. By the end of the week, my mailbox had been knocked over twice, my front porch was egged, and my security cameras caught Karen's dog accidentally using my yard as its personal toilet. It escalated further when a landscaping crew showed up at 7 a.m. on a Saturday, insisting they had an order to trim back the overgrown vegetation. I stepped outside in my robe, arms crossed. I didn't request any landscaping. The worker frowned, checking his clipboard. Says here it's from the HOA. I spotted Karen watching from her porch, her coffee mug raised in mock surprise. Ah, miscommunication. She called over. But now that they're here, I'm sure they can take care of those unruly rose bushes for you. I shut that down fast, sending the landscapers away and filing a formal report. But the harassment didn't stop. Anonymous complaints flooded into the city inspector's office, allegations of structural instability, excessive noise, unsafe porch railings. Every few days, another official showed up at my door, looking exhausted but forced to check for violations. Each time, I calmly produced the historical preservation documents confirming my home's status. Each time, I watched Karen fume from her window. Then came the worst of it. One morning, I found a letter from animal control taped to my door. It accused me of animal neglect, of keeping a malnourished, abandoned dog on my property and denying it medical care. Except I didn't own a dog. I checked my security footage immediately. And there it was, Karen and Bob, sneaking into my yard at 2 a.m., leading a frail-looking dog onto my porch and snapping photos. I felt my stomach turn. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was a deliberate, coordinated attempt to ruin my reputation. I wasted no time filing a formal complaint with animal control, sending them the footage and demanding an investigation into the repeated false claims. But by the time I'd cleared my name, Karen had already spread the rumor all over the neighborhood. Neighbors whispered behind my back. I saw Facebook posts condemning me for neglecting an innocent animal. I even caught a woman taking photos of my house from her car, probably ready to post some fabricated exposé online. And then, as if that weren't enough, I got a call from the city's code enforcement office. There had been a sudden uptick in citations against my property, and now, thanks to the sheer volume of complaints, they were fast-tracking a formal investigation into my home's compliance status. That's when I knew. Karen had bribed someone. That night, as I reviewed my mountain of evidence, I noticed something strange. My security footage showed HOA board members standing near my electrical box, my gas lines, my water meter. They weren't just harassing me. They were scouting vulnerabilities. And that could only mean one thing. They weren't planning to make me comply. They were planning to make me leave. The storm rolled in late that night, thick clouds swallowing the sky as rain lashed against the windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, ominous growl. I had just finished reviewing my security footage when the lights flickered once, then again. And then, darkness. I stood still, heart pounding. Stepping onto the porch, I peered toward Karen's house. Every single window was glowing with warm, uninterrupted light. Not a single flicker. Not a single outage. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way toward the electrical box on the side of my house. The moment I rounded the corner, my foot hit something hard. I pointed my beam down. The cover to my power meter lay on the ground. Someone had been here. Tampered with it. I clenched my jaw, rage curling deep in my chest. I could already hear Karen's voice in my head, "Oh dear, electrical problems? That's what happens with these old homes. You really should modernize." I'd had enough. The next morning, I called an electrician to inspect the damage. His findings? Blatant sabotage. Someone had deliberately loosened the connections, setting me up for potential hazards. I documented everything. Filed a formal police report. But that was just a warning shot. Because 2 days later, my entire world went up in flames. It was a normal morning in the courthouse, until my assistant Emily burst into my chambers, her face drained of all color. "Your Honor, your house. It's on fire." The words barely registered before I was already moving, shoving papers aside, running out of the courthouse. 15 minutes. That's how long it took me to get home. 15 agonizing minutes, watching the skyline, seeing the thick black smoke curling higher and higher. I could smell it before I saw it. That acrid, unmistakable scent of burning wood, of memories being reduced to embers. And then, I turned the corner and saw my home engulfed in flames. The purple trim my grandmother had painted, now blackened and curling at the edges. The windows had shattered from the heat, glass glinting in the sunlight like broken diamonds. The rose garden, gone. The wind chimes, twisted metal, lying in the smoldering wreckage. I stumbled out of my car, throat tightening as firefighters battled the inferno, their hoses blasting water into what was once my family home. And there, standing on her pristine driveway, was Karen. She was sipping her coffee. She wasn't even trying to hide her satisfaction. Beside her, Bob and another HOA board member, Mike, stood watching with that same calm detachment, as if they were admiring a successful business venture. The rage that boiled inside me was so sharp, so blinding, I had to clench my fists to keep from shaking. I turned as the fire chief approached, his face grim. "Ma'am, we're looking at an electrical fire. Old wiring is unpredictable in houses like this." I inhaled sharply. I knew what was coming next. He continued, "Did you have an inspection recently?" "Yes," I answered immediately. "Last month. Everything was up to code." His brow furrowed. "Then this doesn't add up." It didn't. It wasn't an accident. But I wasn't about to show my cards yet. Because just as I reached into my pocket for my phone, something hit me like a lightning bolt. My security cameras. I opened the app, fingers trembling. Blank. The footage had stopped recording at exactly 3 a.m. 4 hours before the fire. My stomach turned to ice. I slowly lifted my gaze back to Karen. She was smirking now. A slight quirk of her lips, barely there, but I saw it. And I knew. I knew she had done this. But she had made a mistake. Because she thought I was just another homeowner she could intimidate. She didn't know that I wasn't just some woman with an old house. I was a federal judge. And I was about to destroy everything she built. The embers were still smoldering when I made my first call. The FBI. The second was to the state attorney's office. The third? A private investigator I trusted. Karen thought she had one. She thought she had buried me under the ashes of my own home, just like she had done to countless others. But she had no idea that I was about to unearth every single crime she had ever committed. I spent the next few days at a hotel, surrounded by stacks of documents, footage, and legal reports, piecing together what I already knew, and what I had just begun to suspect. Karen's HOA wasn't about property values. It wasn't about community improvement. It was a front. And if I was right, my house wasn't the first they had burned. I started digging. Through county records, real estate transactions, old HOA meeting notes, anything I could get my hands on. And then, I found the pattern. Every homeowner who resisted the HOA had been targeted. Harassed, fined into submission, forced to sell for a fraction of what their property was worth. And those who held out the longest? Their houses mysteriously caught fire. The properties were always purchased immediately after by the same buyer, a shell company registered under Karen's sister-in-law's name. And what happened to those properties? They were flipped and sold to luxury real estate developers. It was a racket. Karen was orchestrating the entire thing, pushing out families, burning down history, and selling the land for millions. And her husband, Bob, the retired police sergeant? He was the one making sure that every fire was conveniently ruled an accident. No investigation. No questions asked. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. I hired a private investigator to track down former homeowners who had been victims of Karen's scheme. Their stories were nearly identical to mine. An elderly man, forced to sell his home after mysterious fines and code violations drained his savings. A young couple, whose garage accidentally caught fire after refusing to repaint their house in HOA-approved neutrals. A single mother, who lost her family's home after a gas leak explosion, on a property that had no previous history of gas leaks. And every single one of them had sold their home to Karen's investment group. Then, the breakthrough. One evening, my lawyer received an anonymous tip. The former HOA treasurer, Rebecca Lawson, wanted to talk. We met at a diner 2 towns over, where she slid a USB drive across the table. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "I can't do this anymore." That drive contained 5 years of financial records. Records that showed mysterious cash deposits after every fire. Records that proved money laundering, insurance fraud, bribery. And then, the final nail in Karen's coffin, a list of planned targets. My house had been next. And Karen, in all her arrogance, had already lined up a buyer for my land, before my house even burned. It was all there, in black and white. Emails. Bank transfers. Correspondence between Karen, Bob, and real estate developers, discussing how much they could flip my property for once I was gone. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she could rewrite history. But what she didn't know was that I had already set the final stage of her downfall. I wired up Rebecca for a meeting with Karen. And the FBI was listening. The recording was damning. Karen, laughing about past fires. Joking about how she could always count on Bob to make things go away. Casually threatening Rebecca, saying that if she ever talked, she'd be the next accident. It was enough. Enough for a full-scale federal investigation. Enough for multiple felony charges. Enough to ensure that Karen Thompson's empire would burn far brighter than my home ever had. And now, it was time for me to deliver the final blow. The community center was packed that night. Karen stood at the front of the room, dressed in her usual tailored perfection, flipping through the pages of what I imagined was another list of bogus violations. Her voice rang out confidently, declaring that my now-destroyed property had become an eyesore and that the HOA would be moving forward with redevelopment plans. I stood at the back, waiting for the right moment, letting her bask in the illusion of control. Then, I stepped forward. "I object." The room fell silent. Heads turned. Karen's smirk faltered for the first time as her eyes locked onto mine. I walked slowly toward the front, my heels clicking against the floor. "Actually, I have some evidence of my own to present." I reached into my bag, pulling out a thick folder, and spread photographs across the table. Footage from my security cameras, showing Karen and her board members trespassing on my property the night before the fire. Bank records, tracing bribes, fraudulent transactions, and shell company purchases. And finally, printed transcripts of Karen's own words, captured by Rebecca's wire. Karen's face drained of color. "These could be anything," she snapped, her voice a little too high-pitched. "You can't just..." "Oh, but I can," I interrupted. Then, with slow deliberation, I pulled out my final piece of evidence. My judicial robe. I slid my arms into the fabric, straightened my posture, and turned back to face the crowd. "I am Judge Sarah Martinez, currently presiding over United States v. Thompson et al., a federal RICO investigation into corruption, fraud, arson, and criminal conspiracy." Karen's coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor. "FBI. Nobody move." Right on cue, agents flooded the room. Bob tried to run. He didn't make it 2 steps before they tackled him to the ground. Linda Whitman shrieked as she was handcuffed, and Karen? She collapsed into her chair, staring at me like she'd just seen a ghost. "You know the biggest mistake criminals make?" I asked, leaning slightly toward her. "They get so caught up in their own power, they forget to check who they're dealing with. The clink of handcuffs echoed through the hall as the HOA was led away, their reign of terror finally over. 6 months later, I stood in front of my newly rebuilt home, the purple trim restored exactly as my grandmother had painted it. The roses were growing back, and the community, the real community, had come together stronger than ever. Karen's house was sold at auction, and now, a wonderful immigrant family lived there, hosting barbecues where HOA meetings used to be. I kept Karen's coffee mug on my desk at the courthouse, a reminder that justice always finds its way home. Because bullies like Karen? They think they can bend the world to their will. They think they can rewrite the rules to benefit themselves. But in the end, the law doesn't answer to HOAs. It answers to justice. Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA, or a Karen? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.